I would invite you to turn your Bibles to Numbers chapter 11. That's where we're going to be most of the rest of the morning. Numbers chapter 11. So how are we doing today? Okay? Making progress in life? Anybody here frustrated? Confused? Well, maybe this is your portrait. Years ago, this will date me a little bit, but years ago, I used to subscribe to Christianity Today, and there was a little article in there. It was called Eutychus. Eutychus was, remember, that was the guy who Paul was preaching on and on and on and on past midnight, and there was a guy in this upper third floor room, and he fell out of the window and killed him, and he died, and Paul brought him back to life. Anyway, there was this little cartoonish kind of thing in Christianity Today written by Eutychus, and it turned out years later they identified that author as Warren Wiersbe. But this was in 1990. Thought maybe some of you could relate to this. My frustrated son-in-law recently shared with me the following excerpts from his diary. Saturday, January 11. Slept in today, read the paper, wasted most of the day lying around watching TV. Was listening to Christian radio tonight, though. Challenged by the message. The guy said the problem with the world is too many lazy Christians. Sunday, January 12th. After church, I bade farewell to my wife and kids. Spent the afternoon collecting canned goods for Soup Kitchen in the city. Met the family back at church just in time for the evening service. Speaker talked about the decline of the family. He said fathers don't spend enough time with their children anymore. Monday, January 13th, left work a little early, took the kids out to eat, then to a movie. Great time. Back at home, I was flipping the channels on TV. A special on world hunger caught my eye. You could support someone for an entire month, said the announcer, for the cost of dinner and a movie. Tuesday, January 14th, fasted all day. Then went to the men's fellowship meeting. We had a special speaker who talked about physical fitness, emphasizing that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. He said the key to being in shape is good nutrition and exercise. Ordered a pizza. Wednesday, January 15th, got up at 6 a.m. to jog. After work, shot some hoops with the kids. Driving back from the basketball court, tuned into another radio preacher. This one talked about burnout, said people are so busy with church, family activities, work, etc., they never have time for themselves. Thursday, January 16th, slept in today, read the paper, wasted most of the day lying around, didn't bother to turn on the radio. Well, there are many messages out there in terms of what we are to be and how we are supposed to live. Sometimes we seem to do okay, and other times we fall flat on our faces. We fail. You probably heard that line. It's not said as much anymore, but it used to be all the time. The line, been there, done that. I was at a prayer meeting a few years ago, and somebody prayed something like this: Lord, please protect me and help me so that the testimony of my life does not have to be been there, done that. It kind of hit me between the eyes. You know, it would really be nice to hear sometimes somebody say, been there, but didn't do that. I've noticed that most of my failures have something to do with my view of God, or my wrong view of God, or my wrong response toward God. I fail because I underestimate God. I miscalculate His authority, or His control, or His grace, or His mercy, or His holiness, or His provisions. You name it, I've probably underestimated it. And that leads to complications, that leads to foolish responses, sometimes confusion, sometimes frustration, sometimes ignorant prayers, sometimes despondency. That was true of Moses. Moses actually underestimated God's power, and he ended up trusting his brother instead of the Lord, and that didn't work out so well. Aaron proved to be a thorn in his side. Moses underestimated God's justice, and actually at one point in Exodus 32, he offered to take the punishment that the people deserved. Now that was a noble effort. It's an interesting passage. But actually it would have sent the wrong message and really would have accomplished nothing. See, Moses was not able to atone for the sins of the nation. Only God could do that. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the issue of God's providence. Today, we're going to look at the issue of God's sovereignty. The story that we're going to look at is found in Numbers chapter 11. I want to back up in chapter 10 just for a moment, the last few verses of chapter 10. Verse 33, so they set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey. And the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them 3 days' journey, and to seek out a resting place for them. And the cloud of the Lord was over them by day, whenever they set out from the camp. And whenever the ark set out, Moses said, arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. And when it rested, he said, return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel. What Moses did actually here was he reminded his readers how God visibly demonstrated and manifested his care and his provision for the children of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant, was a symbol of God's presence. It went before the Israelites, and it reminded them that their God was cutting the trail, that their God was leading the way for them through the wilderness. God was never saying to them, although the Bible does picture sometimes as God surrounding them and talking about being in front of them and behind them and beside them, but generally speaking, the picture is God in front of them. It's not like, you guys go ahead, I'll be back here, and if you get into trouble, let me know. It was never anything quite like that. He was out front leading the way. If enemies or hardships were encountered, who encountered them first? It was the Lord. There was also a covering cloud by day and a hovering fire by night. It was God's way of showing the children of Israel his care, of protecting them, almost like a hen protects her chicks. That was the picture of God, providing them security and direction, everything they needed in the wilderness. So here Moses is reminding us that God's sovereign protection and his adequate provision for his people. The application of that for us should be obvious. It's a powerful picture and a great reminder. Sovereignty essentially means that God is free and able to do whatever he wills to do anywhere and anytime he desires. He will carry out every detail of his eternal purpose without interference. And I think the sooner we learn that, the better off we will be, though it may be an ongoing challenge to learn that. If we underestimate that, or we try to resist that, we will find ourselves in the same predicament that Moses was in. And in effect, what Moses was doing was yelling at God and actually blaming God for the mess they were in. Things got so far out of focus that Moses began ordering God to actually take his life. Now, how in the world did that happen? Well, his reaction was, at least in part, a result of absolute emotional overload. Now, some of you know what I mean by that. Some of you have been just all these things of life have just piled on, and emotionally you just were drained. And when that happens, you begin to sort of get cloudy in your understanding of what's going on. And that was happening to Moses. He was trying to do the will of God in his own strength. And frankly, that can't be done. Kids, if you have an activity sheet, we're talking about Moses today. The people kept coming to Moses to voice their unhappiness with God. They wanted Moses to solve their problems. Moses couldn't. So because Moses couldn't solve their problems, he got unhappy with God for making him the leader of the people. So where did the people want to go? See if you can figure that out. And then what was their favorite memory of the past that was not so good in the present? Third, what did they want to eat? And what did God bring them? Next, what happened to many of the people after they ate? And then finally, what had the people failed to do toward God? All right, when you get that all done and we get to the end of the service, we're not going to do the discussion today, but you can meet me out in the narthex, and if you hand me your paper, I'll give you something for that, all right? All right, a hug. No, I'll give you something else. All right. All right, let's start by talking about God is in control, but there's a problem. The people around us are not. That was the situation with Moses. God was in control, but the people that Moses was trying to lead were not. And here's what they were doing. They were complaining, and their two primary complaints were, number one, that life is too hard. And the other one, I guess we could say, is that they were complaining to Moses and complaining about to God, is that life is too predictable. All right, let's take a look at that. First of all, life is too hard. The people complained loud. Let's read a little bit from chapter 11. Here's the first 3 verses. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. So the people were complaining. It's interesting in that first verse, in the hearing of the Lord. Now, the Lord hears everything, but I think what that really was saying is sort of a euphemism for suggesting this. They complained so loudly that it was heard all the way to heaven. I don't doubt that their life was hard. I mean, in fact, they were traveling in the desert. They were tired of the same food and the same scenery and the difficult daily routine. It was hard, and they were tired of it, and they wanted everyone to know. But they blamed God and Moses for their situation. But before we become too sympathetic, how long had they been traveling? Now think about what had happened. They'd gotten out of Egypt. They had traveled a little bit, and then they settled at Mount Sinai, and they were there for quite a while. They'd received the law, so they were kind of settled in that area for some time. And then God said, it's time to move out. It's time to go to the promised land. So they start moving out. They had been on the road, are you ready? Drum roll, for 3 days, okay? That's it. So think about this. They had been in captivity in Egypt for how long, roughly? 400 years. They had been on the road for 3 days. All right? And so they start responding somewhat like an obnoxious kid in the back seat of your car. Are we there yet? How impatient we are with God. Here we are on the way to the promised land, but if it's going to take more than 3 days, if there's going to be some trouble along the way, well then, God, you're going to hear about it. And that's what's going on in this text. The people complained loudly, and they complained often. This was not just complaining about a set of undesirable circumstances. This was complaining that God had dealt them a really bad hand. We were in Egypt, and we cried out to God to deliver us, and he brought us out, and now we're worse off than we were in Egypt. That was their perspective. What kind of God would do that to us? Was their message. It started with a few complaints, and then suddenly everybody's complaining. Have you noticed how contagious complaining is in your home with your kids? One of them got a bum deal, and then all of a sudden all of them have a bum deal, and then mom and dad are frustrated that they've got a bum deal, and the neighborhood's a mess, and the world's a mess, and it goes on and on. Well, that was the situation here. God gave them a powerful and deadly visual reminder that he was still in control. And so he brings this fire. When it talks about burning the outskirts of the camp, what he was talking about was people on the outside. Many of them lost their lives. Then verses 4 to 9. Check this out. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel wept again. Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, garlic. But now our strength is dried up. There's nothing at all but this manna to look at. Now the manna was like coriander seed in its appearance He talks about it, he describes it, he describes how they made, what they did with it. You'll love the last part of this section, verse 8. The people went about and gathered it and ground it in hand mills and beat it with mortars and boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. And then when the dew fell on the camp at night, the manna fell with it. So these people are frustrated. And when we see this picture here, basically 3 phrases more or less tell us how out of control they were and how frustrated they were with God. The first one, I actually wrote a phrase, used a little bit different translation, but essentially it was if only we had the stuff we had in Egypt. If only we had that. Oh, that we had meat to eat. And they're so frustrated. I call this more or less a foolish focus on a pipe dream. People wanted meat, that they were amply fed, but they wanted something different. And verses 4 and 10 describe that. They weren't just frustrated or complaining, they're wailing. You ever seen that? You ever seen a kid in a restaurant in a high chair? That's Israel. They were overwhelmed. They were frustrated with and they're wailing to God, oh, if we only had the melons and leeks and onions and fish. And all we have is this manna. And then the second phrase that comes up, when you hear complaining, that starts with that, oh, if we had this. And then it's, we remember. What's interesting is how they remembered. It's a selective memory. It's a selective focus on the past. The Israelites had it terrible in Egypt. What were they in Egypt? What was their status? They were slaves. They worked very hard for nothing. They were so miserable that they cried out to God for deliverance. And now they're remembering, we remember the fish we had in Egypt, and it didn't cost anything. It was free. And then they remembered the other things that they had, and they didn't think of the hardship. They didn't remember any of that. They weren't focused on going to the promised land. It was, I want something else for supper. It'd be nice to be back in Egypt to eat it. And they were talking as if they enjoyed 7-course meals in fine restaurants in Egypt. We remember the fish we ate for free. They didn't eat anything for free. It was by their own sweat and blood that they received anything. And by the way, the food wasn't that great and it wasn't that plentiful, but their memory was selective. And then they moved from the idea of we remember, to now anything but this. And they look at the manna and they see what it is. Now, if I understand the scriptures correctly, you could do whatever you wanted to with it, and they apparently would mash it and bake it and various things. So they'd come up with something like pita bread or something, some kind of bread that they would eat, or a cake that they would eat. According to what the scriptures defined earlier in Moses' writings, was that if you were to just pick up manna off of the ground and eat it, it tasted like honey wafers. I don't know, I guess when I think about it, as they did all this stuff and it kind of tasted like a cake baked in oil, I don't know, honey wafers kind of sounds better to me. Which may tell us that you really can't improve on God's provision, but I'm not going to stretch that too far. But the idea is that they did everything they could to disguise it, change it, and I guess there's a point where we get tired of stuff. I mean, I eat the same thing for breakfast every morning. I don't even eat at home. I grab something on the way and eat the same thing, so that the guy in the drive-thru at the fast food restaurant doesn't even have to take my order, you know. He hears my voice. I know, you know, and there it is. So I don't mind eating the same thing, but I understand how people could get tired of something. But this was God's provision, and they're in the wilderness, and they have all they want, and they're saying anything but this. The point, I think, is that we will always hear the complaints of people. We expect it, but we need not buy into it. By the way, Do you hear what the Israelites were really saying? They were saying that Pharaoh, the slave master, provided better for them than the God who had redeemed them out of bondage. In effect, they were saying this: God, we just want you to know that we liked Pharaoh better. Isn't that what they were saying? Please remember that God is still in control. Don't lose sight of that. If we do, we will also fall into the same pattern of complaining and behaving foolishly, diminishing God's glory and dishonoring his name. God is in control, but the people around us are not. Now, it goes further than that, because remember, Moses is the leader. God is in control. That's the message of this passage, but we're not. Moses wasn't in control. And the same thing that the people were saying, Moses was saying. Life is hard. Life is too predictable. In verses 10 to 15, listen to this. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. And Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I have found favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness." That's pathetic. But that's where we are sometimes. And that was Moses. As the people complained, he's overwhelmed, so he starts dumping on God. And he starts to blame God. Why have you done this to me? And usually with that then follows self-pity. And that's what you have in verses 12 to 14. I can't do this. The burden is too heavy for me. Why have you done this to me? Followed by the martyr complex. Just put me to death now if I found favor in your eyes. Moses was so out of control he wanted to die. He forgot that God was in control. He underestimated God's sovereignty. And suddenly it's all about Moses and no longer about God. And we struggle with the same thing. In terms of the predictability of life, that goes on in verses 21 and 22. Actually, Moses drew two conclusions concerning the situation. He stopped too soon. He forgot to consider a third option. First, he says, I know who they are. And he starts counting the idea of how many people there are. Now, this is where we get some idea of the size of the Israelites traveling in the wilderness. Moses suggested that there are 600,000 men. These would be military-age men. Now, there were not only men, but there were also children, and there were also women. So a rough estimate, a reasonable estimate, would be that there were 2 or more million people. Now, let's process that for just a minute. That's what Moses is dealing with. A couple of million people. And so he is starting to do this calculation in his head. I know how much that would take to feed that many people, even for one day, and you say that you're going to supply enough to actually feed them for a whole month. There are too many. I can count. By the way, did you hear God asking Moses to do the math? I don't remember that. I don't remember him saying, check the supplies and see if we have enough. I don't remember that. In fact, that wasn't the case. And then number 2, he not only says, I know who they are, but he also says, I know who I am, and I can't supply that much. Even if we take all the livestock and slaughter them, it wouldn't be enough. And I can't do that anyway. And if we caught all the fish in the sea, it wouldn't be enough. Now, when we start getting overwhelmed with the circumstances of life and overwhelmed emotionally, you notice how we tend to exaggerate? If we caught all the fish of the sea, it wouldn't be enough to feed these people, which again is ridiculous. I know who I am and I'm inadequate, Moses is saying, and he's right. But what did he forget? I know who they are, I know who I am, so he looks around, he looks within. Where did he forget to look? Up. He forgot to consider God. I know who you are. No matter how predictable life is, no matter who they are and who we are, none of that matters nearly as much as who he is. The people were out of control. Moses was out of control, and in so doing, he underestimated God's control. God can do what he wants to do when he wants to do it, and we need to learn that lesson, and we need to trust him. That's what Moses was not doing. So we start out with the people, they're wailing and all upset, and then we start with Moses, and he's doing the same. But God is in control, and now here's what we need to watch. First of all, we need to watch his justice and mercy, and God demonstrated that in the first couple of verses of the text, where he brought judgment on the people. But also, there's a situation where we need to watch his counsel. Moses was stressed so far that he was ready to pack it in. So what did God say? As more and more of these challenges come on Moses, people from the beginning of the morning throughout to the very end of the day, there were people constantly coming to Moses to sort out their problems. Do you remember any place in the Bible where that happened before this? All the way back in Exodus chapter 18. Moses' father-in-law came to visit him. Remember his name? Jethro, wasn't it? So Jethro comes, and he's watching Moses. And these people are bringing all their problems, and Moses is overwhelmed with the load, and this keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming. Finally, the father, this is bad when your father-in-law calls you aside and says, what you're doing is not good. You don't really want to hear that, but he says that to him, and he says, this is not good. What you need to do is you need to have other people deal with some of these other problems. You can take the big ones if you want, but you don't have to listen to everything. So Moses took that counsel, but he forgot. And now he's back doing it again. So every time people would have a problem, they would come to him. It was kind of like a Judge Judy kind of thing. You know, he's got to sort all this out and give some kind of a ruling on this. And this was just absolutely, utterly consuming to him. And so he's dealing with all of that. So God tells him, here's what's going to happen. There are going to be 70 guys, and I'm going to put my spirit on them, and they're going to probably, the idea of them prophesying demonstrated to the people that these were authenticated counselors, if you will, to give wise rulings. And so this idea of being able to delegate responsibility was given to Moses in order that he could handle the situation. This text says that God took the spirit that was on Moses and put that spirit on 70 elders. And then God told Moses to watch his power. We have, first of all, the power of his provision. Now, this is amazing. In verses 23 and then 31 to 34, you get this picture. I'm not exactly sure what happened. The Bible isn't exactly clear, and some commentators have taken this into a wild perspective. But think of this. Quail come in from the sea. And it's not just a few. If there are 2 million people, I don't know how many families that would be, but a lot. And every family group gathered 60 bushels. You know what a bushel is? Can you imagine? So the people got a lot. Now, these quail, when they came, the Bible might mean that they just kind of dropped there on the outskirts of the camp, and the people went and gathered them. But it also talks about 2 feet. I don't think it meant they were 2 feet deep necessarily, but one commentary suggested that these quail are flying in, and the people are beating them down, and just knocking them down, and then taking them and finishing them off, and then taking them home to eat that. But the point is, they had lots of food. Now, what they did, What the reason for God's judgment after that is a little bit unclear. Maybe they ate him with the blood, maybe whatever. But it was a demonstration of their greed and their demands for God, that first God gives the provision and then he gives the judgment. And the Lord's anger burned against the people, and he brought this terrible plague upon them, and a whole bunch of them died. And again, we're not for sure why, but there is a clue in Psalm 106, verses 13 and 14. Listen to this text. But they soon forgot what he had done and did not wait for his counsel. In the desert, they gave in to their craving. In the wasteland, they put God to the test. So he gave them what they asked for, but sent a wasting disease upon them. The place was known as graves of craving, or graves of lust. So I think what was happening is the people so much wanted this, that what God did was he first gave them provision, so he showed them that he is able to provide for them. But he also brought judgment because they had not listened to him and they had not believed that he was able to do that. They could never charge him with not providing because he provided. But now he can show them his judgment for them not trusting him in the whole situation. So the Lord first sent the quail, and then after that, he brought about judgment, and many of them died. Now, put all that together, here's what I'm saying about this. Most of us could probably say, in reference, not exactly like Moses, but we've been in situations where we've been overwhelmed emotionally, completely overwhelmed, where we're ready to give up, we're ready to check out. Whether it's check out of the family, check out of a relationship, check out of life. So we've been there and done that. We have a vague concept that God is sovereign and that he can and will do whatever he pleases, but we tend to underestimate that in our daily lives. And when we do, we cease to be aware of his control, and we soon get out of control, and we start complaining and whining about our present situation, our present circumstances, believing that life is too hard, and at the same time, life is too predictable. And we beg for change, and then we get further and further away from the Lord and understanding that he is in control, and we become basket cases. Moses was way out of line, but God dealt gently with him, especially because Moses took his complaint to God. If you're going to complain, better to talk to God than to talk to everybody else. And Moses did that. But also the idea here is that Moses forgot that his job was not to solve all the problems of the Israelites. He was put in a place of leadership, but ultimately it's God who carries his people. Do you ever feel like you're overburdened by other people's problems? You're overwhelmed by that? That was Moses. Moses didn't realize that God had never called him to carry the burdens of the Israelites. He called Moses to give leadership to the Israelites and to be with them as they traveled to the wilderness, but not to bear their burdens. Throughout the Bible indicates that those heavy burdens that we cannot carry, what are we supposed to do with those? What did Peter say? Cast all your, help me, cares upon him, because why? He cares for you. Moses forgot that. And so when the burdens stacked up, he started complaining instead of giving them back to the Lord. What I was trying to do with this little series, we got one more left, is to show you that sometimes we become so despondent that we're ready to quit. Sometimes we're just physically exhausted, and we need to deal with that. Sometimes we believe a lie that everything's against us. Sometimes the problems and challenges of others just stack up on us, and we become so emotionally overwhelmed we can't get our head around that. We start to get all consumed by that, and then we start crying out to God to just take us away. It all keeps coming back to the idea that God knows what he's doing. God is a God who takes care of us in terms of providentially. He also takes care of us in terms that he's in total control. That's sovereignty. And he also provides for us everything that we need. Is that true? Has he provided for you salvation? Has he given you breath to breathe today? Does he have your life in his hand? Yes. So in the end, do you really have any reason to be afraid or to be overwhelmed or to be fearful? No. Can we remember? We've all been there. We've all done that. Let's move ahead from there. When we get there again, let's trust him, and we'll see his hand. Father, help us in our lives not to whine and complain about our circumstances, to see them in some way that you know what you're doing, that you have brought these things into our life to teach us our need for you. Sometimes they're brought into our life to teach us that we can't handle all those situations, to teach us to get help from one another, to teach us to keep on looking to you for grace, to teach us that we are so dependent on you. Help us to learn those lessons. Help us to be grateful for what you give to us every day. It may not be all that we think we need. It may not be all we want. It may not be the way we want it. But help us to learn to trust you and to receive it as a gift from you. Grant us your grace today. And for those maybe who are here who really don't understand what it means to believe in a God and to understand that God is a sovereign God and that he has provided a way for us to have eternal life, I pray that whether it was something that was said during our communion time or something in this message, that somehow you would use that to open up their minds and hearts to believe who you are and to see in you redemption, deliverance, life. Thank you for the word. Thank you for giving us perspective on the challenges of our daily experience. And thank you for giving us answers. And those answers always come from you. And essentially, those answers always are you. So thank you for your sovereign control. Thank you for your mercy and grace. Thank you for who you are and what you've done for us that we might know you.